It has been, man, almost 3-4 weeks since we've talked to George. Welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. It's been a minute, and I don't know if our audience can tell because we've had them all lined up and pre-recorded some stuff, but it's been a while. How's it going, man?
Yeah, I feel like I haven't talked to you in weeks, and it's funny because I came on to ease your burden, so to speak. And I guess I've been doing exactly that because I haven't been able to get a hold of you for the last few weeks.
Yeah, we, thank you, by the way. We went to Utah, dropped off the kids with the grandparents, and my wife and I went up to the Grand Tetons and up through Yellowstone. We had the first vacation together without kids since our almost 4-year-old was born. So it was long overdue between residency and the finishing of dental school and moving to Texas, all this. And I didn't have to do any podcast work. It was awesome. So thank you, George.
No problem. And it just happened to line up where all of my episodes were released while you were gone. So the audience is sick of hearing my voice, and now they get you today.
Yeah, no, I think those banking episodes were awesome. And I think anyone who had banking questions now has had them answered because you asked them all. So we're good to go there. The one thing that I was thinking about as we've put in systems for the podcast, and we're talking about systems and how to run a dental practice like a business in season 2, I was thinking about how amazing it's been that I can literally trust that you will take all of this, and we have someone who's doing the editing for us and the publishing. We've got everything lined up, and it allowed me to take such a better vacation. I feel like that's one of the reasons I'm passionate about systems in a dental practice, is that it allows you as an owner and as a dentist to focus on the clinical dentistry, to focus on the big issues, to take vacations, because everything else is dialed in. And it's not like it doesn't need any attention. I should respond to your text and Facebook messages eventually, George, but I can ignore you for a few days, and I know it's not going to all implode.
Exactly. And, I think also the benefit of that is that it becomes, we've always envisioned Shared Practices being much more than just a podcast.
Yeah.
And that allows us to then, have our attention on other areas while the podcast is still running.
And I'm excited. We're lining up some things coming up here pretty soon. We're going to have some bonus episodes, little mini seasons that are intermixed into this season. We've got the accelerator, the ownership accelerator that we're working on. So we've got some really cool stuff. And now that you've got the podcast production dialed in, I'm not spending every moment editing and uploading these episodes. So this episode today is with Rich Andrus of Menlo Group, and he is a friend and colleague of Matt Porter's. They work together transitioning dental practices. And so Matt does the broker side of things, and Rich does the real estate side of things. And I met Rich in dental school, and it was when I got my realtor's license, and I actually kind of wanted to do, and I still do, want to do commercial real estate eventually as kind of like, my 7th job eventually. And there's a certification, like it's called the CCIM, that you can get certified in commercial real estate as a realtor. And so I was like asking him all these questions, and I'm sure he was like, who the heck is this kid? He's like, just friggin' go to dental school and worry about that crap later. But he had great content, great answers to my questions. I learned a lot in today's interview, and hopefully you did too. And I think our audience is going to like it.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of information here. Definitely jam-packed.
Cool. Well, here we go. Okay, I've got with us today Rich Andrus from Menlo Group Commercial Real Estate, who's also a partner with Matt with Menlo Transitions. So I know you have a ton of experience with dental commercial real estate, specifically in the Phoenix Valley. And I had heard of you from one of my dental school faculty, Dr. Goins. You helped her out, and she kind of raved about what you were able to do for her, taking her out of a lease and putting her into a space, and really saved her in a big way before I even knew that you and Matt were friends and that you and Matt would end up working together. So I've heard of you, like 4 years ago, and now it's cool to finally get to interview you. So thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be on the show. I mean, I've focused specifically on dental commercial real estate here in the Phoenix Valley for the last 7 years, and have a lot of stories and seen a lot of things, and excited to be on the show and help your listeners.
Well, awesome. It seems like such a random sub niche of commercial real estate, dental commercial real estate, and then the Phoenix Valley. But I guess the Phoenix Valley is so big and there's so many dentists there that over the years, you have this wealth of experience just helping dentists. So I think that's why we have you here on the podcast, because you are the expert on this. So I appreciate that.
You bet. You bet. Excited to be on the show.
Okay, cool. So there's three overarching ideas that I want to dive into today and ask you a bunch of questions. And I don't even have probably enough knowledge to know the right question. So I'm going to have you guide me and give me some specifics here. But there's three scenarios that I think are common for a transition with real estate. So number one is that you buy a practice and there's already a lease in place. And that lease is with the previous landlord. And there can be some trouble transitioning that lease to the new owner. There can be terms that are unfavorable. The lending can get involved with all of this. So that's the first topic we're going to go into. The second topic is going to be this idea of, should I buy the space if you have the option to? And so the decision to buy or not to buy, and then if you decide to buy, what you need to make sure you can do to do that correctly, and how to know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And then lastly, the unique situation where you come into the practice and the previous doc wants to retain the real estate, and now you are his new tenant. And so you're creating from scratch a lease, and you need to kind of figure out a relationship that works there. And it can maybe be a little bit of an interesting dynamic because it used to be their practice. And so some specifics that we can do to get the best result in that relationship. So is that enough to throw on the plate as a conversation for today?
Absolutely. We'll have a good dialogue. No question.
Okay, cool. So if someone was buying a practice and they're getting to the point where, okay, they're pretty serious about this, when should they get access to the current lease? When is that going to be triggered in their conversation? So it's probably going to be after the letter of intent, and they're going back and forth, they're doing their due diligence. When is the right time to ask for the lease?
You know what? I think that the right time to ask for the lease is right when the due diligence period starts.
Okay.
Right. And even before, when you're creating the letter of intent, understanding what the economics of the lease look like, really, and understanding whether or not you have the ability to renegotiate or what the status of the lease is prior to creating the letter of intent is probably the right time. But most sellers are not going to hand you the full copy of the lease for your review prior to due diligence phase. But understanding, hey, what does the lease term look like? What does the lease rate look like? You know, how many square feet? You know, those types of things from a lease perspective are critical to have prior to letter of intent because they can help shape your offer.
Okay, so maybe you wouldn't be asking for the whole lease before the letter of intent, but maybe you would go to the broker and say, oh, hey, I just had a few questions about the lease, and the broker will know this. They'll know the square footage. They're going to know maybe the remaining term on the lease. If they've done their due diligence, they should be able to ask you answer some quick questions for you before requesting the whole thing.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so that's kind of your initial information gathering. The specific things that you should ask them at that point, you should ask them, you said square footage, and then what else should you ask about the lease?
Yes, square footage, the length of term, and the length of term becomes critical when you're buying a practice because specifically when you have financing. Okay. Most dental banks in today's market require a minimum of 10 years of term. Now, be careful because that 10 years of term does not have to be an obligated term. You can have a 5-year lease with a 5-year option, and the bank will view that as 10 total years. But you need to have either options or committed term for a minimum of 10 years with most dental banks in today's marketplace. Okay. So let's break that down because maybe some of our listeners have like rented apartments or maybe they've bought a house. So this, a lot of this real estate stuff might be new to them. So typically in a rental situation, you're doing like a 1-year lease. So if you're renting a house or an apartment, you do 1 year at a time. With real estate, what is typical for that length? The majority of dental leases they run in 3, 5, 7, or 10-year increments. That is the 99% of leases in the commercial real estate space are 3, 5, 7, or 10-year leases.
Okay, cool.
And typically when you're doing a startup dentist would typically have a 10-year lease in order for the landlord to help contribute tenant improvements and some sort of, because there's larger outlay from the landlord, so they need to recoup their cost. And they do that by adding term on the lease. It's rare in the situation that we're talking about right now, when you buy a practice and the landlord and you're simply assuming the lease, it's very rare to see a dentist enter into a 10-year contract. In fact, in my opinion, it's dangerous to enter into a 10-year contract at the time when you do a lease assumption in purchasing the practice, because from my experience, it is rare that a landlord gives you large enough concessions to warrant that type of obligation.
Okay. So let me go back a step and ask you a question then. For tenant improvements, so someone who isn't familiar with tenant improvements, because you mentioned that, and it plays into this. If you're doing a startup, which is a whole different season of the podcast, so we don't need to get into this in depth, but if you're doing a startup, the landlord kind of helps you out with some money up front to pay for things. Is that basically what tenant improvements is?
Yeah, and basically at any time that you do a startup, or you're entering into a new contract with the landlord, or you're doing a renewal, that is an event where you simply have an opportunity to ask the landlord to reinvest in their real estate and bring the real estate up to snuff, if you will. So for example, depending on the term of the lease, if you're buying a practice and the practice has a term that's less than 18 months left in the lease, then you have a really awesome opportunity to go to the landlord and it depends. This is all market specific.
Okay.
But in most markets, the landlord will provide you some level of tenant improvement package. Let's call it $5, $7, or $10 a square foot. So that's anywhere between $15,000 to $30,000 to update the space.
Interesting.
And it's awesome to buy a practice and then receive money from the landlord to do new carpet, new paint, fix the cabinetry, every dentist that walks into a new space wants to make it a little bit more like them, and maybe change the consultation room or whatever it may be. There's lots of different options, but that's why that lease term is so important. Depending on the lease term that you have left on that lease allows you to know whether or not you have the ability to negotiate with the landlord and get some of these things that are very common in a lease renewal situation.
Okay, so interesting. So initially, I would have thought that having longer, like 5 years left on the lease that was pre-existing, would be a good thing for lending, because then you just need 5 more years of options, or you need to renegotiate with a new lease and some options after that. But if the lease is running out and you're coming into the practice, that's an opportunity to not just renegotiate the terms, but also get some money to do like a little remodel, a little touch up or improvement, so that the property maintains its value and the landlord sees that you're committed to maintaining the property, and then you have this ability to invest a little bit. I didn't know that. So this is awesome already. How hard, what percentage of the time, if done right, in your experience, do they say yes most of the time or no most of the time? Is this hard to do if it's not a startup?
Actually, it's very common. And again, it's very market specific. But let me give you an example. I just signed a lease assumption 2 weeks ago with a client who's buying a practice. The practice has been in existence for 25 years in the same location. And, you can imagine what a 25-year-old dental space looks like. It's a little bit older. Now, and the space, the guy's fee for service, he's cranking. It's the perfect practice to buy. Of course, the buyer doesn't want to move that practice. He doesn't, even though it's old and a little bit,
dated maybe in a few spots.
Dated. Yeah, it's just simply you're not going to move that type of practice.
Yeah.
Especially when you're purchasing, and the banks don't want you to move it, right? I mean, really, that creates more risk. And so everybody wants you to stay there. The selling dentist lease was expiring in November. So we had about 5 months left, 4 or 5 months left of lease term. And it was simply a conversation with the buying dentist that said, hey, we have an opportunity to enter into a new lease. And so we went and approached with a standard letter of intent. Now, this is after the buyer and seller of the practice have a letter of intent and an agreement, and they're working towards close. I took a letter of intent, a non-binding letter of intent to the landlord, and requested $10 a square foot in improvements for carpet, paint, cabinetry, some updates. And in this case, in this market, I even requested 5 months of free rent.
Wow.
On a 5-year lease. So the day that this individual bought the practice, now his situation was a little bit different because he bought the practice and needs to continue with the same lease terms as the selling dentist through November.
Okay.
But at the end of November, he has 5 months of rent abatement.
No way.
He pays no rent, and we negotiated for approximately $20,000 of tenant improvement dollars for him to be able to
renovate
space. And we negotiated that those tenant improvement dollars would be available immediately.
Huh.
So he can actually start that. He doesn't have to wait till November. The other interesting thing that we did in this immediate situation is he felt like the space needed a couple of more operatories. And so we put a first right of refusal on the adjacent space.
Okay.
And we have a first right of refusal. And prior to going in the lease, we actually negotiated what the tenant improvements allowance would be if he expanded and created 2 or 3 more ops.
Oh, wow. So is the adjacent space currently occupied or currently empty?
The adjacent space is actually currently occupied.
Okay.
However, in this circumstance, the landlord believes that they are moving.
Nice.
So, we figured all of that out, and we're able to have a really strong negotiation to where, hey, he's assuming the lease, the practice transition is closed, the lease has been signed, but now we haven't lost our negotiation. We haven't lost any leverage in the negotiation. We already have what the tenant improvement dollars are going to be if he decides to expand. It's already in the lease contract.
That's awesome.
Option at his election. Should they move out? Should the other tenant move out? We have at his election what it looks like for him to move in. And so we have tenant improvement dollars for him to be able to do with 5 months of rent abatement. And so all of that is very negotiable. And that is simply a buyer that is purchasing a practice that has been in existence for 25 plus years with the retiring dentist.
That's
very
awesome.
Common. That is very common.
Okay, cool. This is opening my mind to kind of what's possible in this transaction and realizing that bringing on someone like you early, not at the end when the banker is like, oh, well, did you look at the lease? And, you're like, oh, crap. Well, I'll just have my lawyer look at the lease. Bringing on someone with market specific experience who knows dental, who understands what your needs for expansion could be, and also how to negotiate these things and how to think about these things. I think that person would wholeheartedly say that it was worth it to bring you on early in the process.
Absolutely. Without question. And the other thing that you need to know is that who paid me in that circumstance? The landlord is who made the payment, because the landlord wants a 5-year lease.
Mm.
He realizes that the selling dentist is going to retire and leave.
Yeah.
And so the landlord's actually in this situation. Now, that's not always the situation, but in this particular situation, the buying dentist received huge incentive. He had all the tenant improvement dollars he received. He received the rent abatement. He actually got a lower lease rate by $3 a square foot.
Wow.
And so, at the end of the day, the buying dentist, he loves what the practice looks like with all the economics before. All of a sudden you juice a little bit of those returns by reducing the overhead in the rent and making the space look nicer. He's going to have a big pop and going to enjoy that.
Well, and that's money left on the table that the price of the practice isn't going to change because this wasn't in place before you did this. So it's like he's just found this money that you found for him.
You're exactly right.
Well, and I bet the banks love you too, because now the practice is set up in a much more stable position financially. And so getting financing might even be easier for him, or he might even be able to negotiate better terms because of this favorable situation.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
We do that a lot. Now, I want to correct one, not necessarily correct, but I want to just caution. This happens if a lease term is short, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes you'll have a landlord, you'll have a dentist that has a longer term lease. When you have a longer term lease, let's say you're dealing with a lease that, is a 10-year lease and you're buying the practice with 7 years left of term.
Okay.
In that situation, you really have very little negotiation power. Unless the selling dentist is financially in trouble or sick, or there's some event that's causing uncertainty with the landlord's mind with that tenant, it's very difficult to change lease terms. In those circumstances, you're almost always subject to simply assuming the lease as is and just simply taking it. So that lease term, that's why I like to have that question before you even make an offer. What is the lease term?
Sure.
If it's a short lease term, then you have some negotiation power and you have some leverage potentially. If it's a long lease term, then you realize, hey, there's not much I can really do with the lease. Let's just make sure the lease is acceptable before we do anything, before we jump into any negotiations on this.
As a dental student who is planning on buying a practice, I have contacted just about every bank you can think of trying to get a loan. Every bank I've talked to has told me the same thing. They don't loan to a dentist without a year's experience. Some even want 2 years. I was told repeatedly my only option was to do an SBA loan, which after all the fees amounts to about 7% over 8 years. I was still planning on proceeding since I felt like the benefits of practice ownership outweighed the added cost of an SBA loan. Then, in the process of doing the interviews for this podcast, I met David Alvey. Since the moment I met him, I was blown away. I was so impressed with his knowledge of the industry and how his bank gets it when it comes to financing new grads. They understand the industry well enough to work with new grads and dentists with less experience. They look more at the practice that you are financing than the individual getting the loan itself. Since deciding to go with him to do my loan, I have gone from feeling like I had a coin flip's chance of getting a conventional loan to being confident that my deal will get done coming right out of school with great terms. After doing my interview with David, I knew Atlantic Commercial Credit was the perfect sponsor for this podcast. At Shared Practices, we strive to pave the way to practice ownership, and financing is a big part of that. Richard and I are thrilled to be able to endorse them as a financing solution for individuals who have been told they cannot obtain a loan by other banks. If you are like me and had any doubts about your ability to get a loan, contact me at georgehariri@gmail.com. I'll leave my email in the show notes. I'll put you in contact with David Alvey, who has agreed to do a consultation with anyone I send his way. He understands what we teach on the podcast and is excited to help our listeners get financed. If you are like me and desire to get into practice ownership early in your career, don't let financing be a reason why that doesn't happen for you.
Okay, that's awesome. That brings it back because this is something really simple. You can ask the broker up front, and with that one piece of data, the length of term left on the lease, you know a little bit of something about your potential to negotiate and maybe get a better deal with the real estate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So let's go back to this circumstance where there's 7 years left on this 10-year lease. The bank is going to do a 10-year term loan for that option to renew for the last 3 years. So now you're going to do a lease assumption. You're going to take on this existing lease, make sure that the terms are acceptable, and we'll get into that in a second of what terms to look out for and how to do that. And then do you just go to the landlord and say, I need to build in an option to renew these last 3 years? How do you do that?
That's correct. So you go in with a standard lease assumption and request a standard lease assumption, and you want to simply assume the lease. And at that moment, there are specific things that the landlord has the right to ask you as a buyer to produce.
Okay.
Number one, this is just the basic premise. Typically, the selling dentist is a little bit more financially well off than the buying dentist. Sure. In lots of cases.
Yeah.
And so from a landlord's perspective, they're trading out a tenant in lots of cases that tenant is more solid, financially has had no problems paying the bills. And you have to keep in mind that they're trading that tenant out, and you're asking them to trade it out for a younger doctor who's just come out of school that has student loan debt, has a car payment, and has a house payment.
Yeah.
And so we need to keep in mind, as a buying dentist, we need to keep in mind that that's the thought process from a landlord. And so we need to do anything we can to help that landlord understand that, hey, you can take a risk on me. I'm a good guy.
Yeah.
can take a risk on me being your tenant. And so you need to understand that everything that you do to that landlord, everything you give to that landlord needs to deliver that message. And as a broker in the dental space, we do a significant amount of positioning to help landlords understand the risk factor of a new dentist coming in, and understanding that, hey, they've been pre-qualified with the bank and the bank's requirements are X, Y, and Z. That's why we feel very comfortable and confident that they'll be able to come in and assume this lease correctly. So the first step is, let's just make sure we can get a lease assumption.
How often I've heard of nightmare situations where the previous lease has provisions in it that you can't assume this lease. Is that a common thing, or is that more like a worst case scenario? I hope this doesn't happen to me.
Yeah. So in every lease, I shouldn't say every, but the majority, 99.9% of leases have an assumption clause.
Okay.
Inside that assumption clause, there are words that are very key. And the key words that a buying dentist needs to look for are cannot be unreasonably withheld.
Okay. And what does that mean?
So yeah, there are two provisions. In that, it basically says, hey, the landlord has the right to review financials or review whatever they may ask for from anyone that the current tenant or the selling dentist brings to assign the lease to. So the assigning dentist or the buying dentist needs to provide typically some level of financial forms, lease applications and such to the landlord. And the words that you don't want to see are in the landlord's sole discretion. Leases are typically written with the words in the landlord's sole discretion. And that's why it's critical to utilize a broker, a real estate agent, a real estate broker that has knowledge of the entire dental life cycle of real estate.
Okay.
Because when you get into real estate, you need to make sure that lease clause says not to be unreasonably withheld. Because if the lease clause says in the landlord's sole discretion, then that's where the nightmare stories that everyone's heard come from.
Okay.
Because the landlord has the sole discretion whether or not they want to trade out the selling dentist for the buying dentist. And they have the right to be able to decline it.
Okay.
And so looking at the lease assumption clause within the lease is critical. That's the first thing I would say you need to go and do when you receive the lease in the due diligence process. And you need to look for, what are the things the landlord's going to require of me? Is the landlord's ability to make this decision not to be unreasonably withheld? Mm-hmm. Which means that if they were going to lease the space down the road or down the hall to someone that has the same level of credit and the same financial stability that the buying dentist has today, then why wouldn't they allow the buying dentist to come in and assume this lease? Okay,
so that's what we're asking when they're asking them to be reasonable, is saying like, okay, given that this person's creditworthiness and the situation, you would be renting spaces to this type of person. So therefore, you're going to allow this person to assume the lease, versus at the landlord's sole discretion, they can say, no, I want someone else. I don't care if it's a dentist. We're going to put a nail salon in here. And they can, at that point, would that be like completely different and saying that what am I trying to say here? I've heard of clauses or verbiage basically allowing them to do whatever they want when the lease transfers, versus is this saying the lease will still transfer, but they can screw with you? Is that?
Yeah. Good question. So in that lease assumption section, there's usually a clause called a recapture clause.
Mm-hmm.
And the recapture clause, Richard, is where people get into trouble. The recapture clause usually says something like this, if there is one. It says something like this: hey, the tenant shall have the right to assign the lease, which shall not be unreasonably withheld. Mm-hmm. That's what I want it to say.
Okay.
Under the following provisions, and it goes through the things that everyone has to provide to the landlord in order for them to make a decision.
Okay.
And then there's usually another clause. It's usually not in the same section. It's in the same assignment section, but it's usually not in the same subsection, that says something to the extent, if the landlord chooses, the landlord can cancel the lease with the tenant and take the space back in 30 days.
Okay. So that's the dangerous one.
That's dangerous. Now, the purpose of a recapture clause, though, is not dangerous. The purpose of a recapture clause is, hey, if you bring us an assignment and we want to enter into the lease directly with that dentist, then we want the option to be able to cancel this lease and enter into a lease directly with the buying dentists.
Okay.
And that's what most landlords use the recapture clause for. However, there's that one or two people that have had a horror story where they get a bad landlord, which they do exist.
Sure.
And the landlord uses the recapture clause to say, hey, we don't like that we view the fact that you're selling your practice as risky. We don't want to be around for this type of transaction. We have Jimmy John's wants to come into our space. So We'll just cancel your lease, take the lease back and kick you down the road. And that has happened. And that's why people get nervous about recapture clauses. When you're negotiating a new lease and a renewal or something of that nature, getting language in a recapture clause that basically says that this can only happen if you're entering into the new lease with the guy that you're bringing as the buyer. That type of language is what we like to see in a recapture clause.
Okay. So if someone had bought the real estate, so now there's a new landlord from who originally leased it. So maybe the original guy was reasonable and now some crazy comes in and you don't have that extra clause within the recapture clause, then this new crazy guy can't kick you out. The lease stays as is.
Yeah, and that's what you want. And whether it's the new guy or the old guy, you just want to have it be very clear that, hey, Mr. Landlord, you can absolutely exercise the recapture clause in a circumstance where the recapture clause is simply you're canceling my lease as the selling dentist and entering into a new lease with the buying dentist. Because I don't want to be on the lease anyway. So most lease assumptions are 2 or 3 pages long and basically just transfer the entire lease document to the buying dentist. That's what's most common. But when a landlord exercises the recapture clause, he's basically saying, I want to do away with the current lease and enter into an entire new lease with the buying dentist.
Okay. Is there ever a circumstance, and I've heard this kind of the other way around, where the lease is not assumable at all, and so therefore the old dentist is still like completely on the hook for the old lease even after they've left?
Okay. So there's 2 scenarios that are happening there. Number one, usually the lease is assumable. Okay. But the selling dentist typically, and in most cases, in most markets, landlords require personal guarantees. And a personal guarantee is basically this. It's saying, hey, you're signing the lease in the name of some entity, some LLC.
Okay.
Which you should always do. You should never sign the lease in your personal name.
Okay, good point.
So you sign your lease in an entity. Well, the personal guarantee basically says, hey, I'm sitting behind this entity, and I guarantee that if this entity fails, you can come after me personally. And that's what most landlords require, is a personal guarantee.
At the end of the day, they kind of want their money. That's
right. And they want, hey, unfortunately, it's happened. A dentist has just bankrupted an LLC and moved right down the road and got out of their lease.
Sure.
That's what a landlord's trying to avoid with a personal guarantee.
Okay.
The only way to get out of a personal guarantee, well, there's lots of ways, but one of the ways to get out of personal guarantee is personal bankruptcy. Right. And so it's just a little stickier of a deal as personal guarantees.
You can't just bankrupt the entity. You have to bankrupt the entity and yourself.
That's exactly right. So personal guarantee secures the place for the landlord. It secures that you're not going to just change the entity name to, some, Smile Dentistry LLC 2 instead of Smile Dentistry LLC, something.
Right.
So and a patient would never even know that you changed the name of the entity because you're doing business as something different. And so it's been used as a tactic to get out of leases so many times or often, not just in dental leases, but across the board.
Sure.
So landlords require personal guarantees to get a little bit stickier on the lease. So that explains what a personal guarantee is. Personal guarantees typically do not expire when you transition a lease. So the selling dentist is on a personal guarantee, and the landlord says, okay, selling dentist, you stay on the personal guarantee until the end of the term, and buying dentist, you also are going to be on a personal guarantee.
Huh.
The horror stories that you hear happen when the buying dentist has purchased the practice, ends up failing in that practice location,
Okay.
or ends up moving out of that practice location, and the landlord then goes after the buying dentist because they have personal guarantees for the remainder of the lease, and goes after the selling dentist because they never got off the hook.
Is it kind of like real estate where there's like a first lien, second lien, where they come after one first and then the other, or you're saying they're coming after both at the same time?
Yeah, my experience is they come after both at the same time. A landlord just wants to get even, and they send letters from their attorneys to all parties.
Okay.
And they usually come after them for the loss, whatever that loss may be. And so it depends. I have a circumstance where 3 dentists went into business together and opened a practice. Okay, they opened a new practice, and one of those 3 dentists decided to work that location, and that was the arrangement. They were 3 friends. They knew each other. Well, they ended up parting ways not as friends. So all 3 dentists, the partnership broke apart, and they dissolved the entities such that the dentist that was actually working the location now became the 100% owner.
Okay.
And he assumed the lease from the entity that had the 3 dental owner. And so there was a proper lease assumption that occurred. However, none of the dentists, the 3 dentists, did not get off the guarantees. Oh,
wow. Okay. I see where this is going.
Yeah. The dentist that was there that assumed the deal, life happened. Unfortunately, he got divorced.
Oh, dang it.
And most of the time when leases go bad, when real estate goes bad in dentistry, there's usually a life event. I've seen it with gambling. I've seen it with addictions. I've seen it divorce, disabilities. Those types of things are really what make a dental practice, crumble.
Sure.
In most cases. And so when this life event happened, there's some circumstances that occurred. Long and short is the dentist that was working the location filed for bankruptcy and left the location. Well, sure enough, 6 months later, I get a phone call from the partners who have just been served on guarantees.
Oh.
And
what was the ballpark total?
You know what? That ballpark total is about $40,000. It wasn't, that's actually very low. I was
going to say, it feels like it could be worse, especially if you're splitting that 3 ways.
Well, the bank sold the practice to another doctor. All right. And so that doctor then assumed the lease. And so the only thing that the landlord could really go after was the loss of the between the 95% and the sell of the practice. So it's not like they're going after, say it's $1 million lease, and they're going after the $1 million.
They renegotiated with the new dentist, $960, and so now that difference of $40 is what the landlord's coming after him for.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The other that's important to understand is in lots of states, personal guarantees require spouse signatures. So Arizona specifically is a community property state.
Yeah.
So when you sign a lease in Arizona and it has a guarantee in it, both husband and wife are signing in most cases.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The only time that they get around that is if the individual dentist has an individual net worth that is sole and separate from his spouse. And you have to produce lots of documentation on that. I've seen it done, but in most cases, your spouse signs. So, not only is the other dentists being served, their spouses are being served as well.
Wow. Okay. And it's funny because I was a realtor briefly in dental school for residential real estate, but I didn't realize that applied to commercial real estate in Arizona as well. So that sucks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and that's all just based on the laws of the state, right? I mean, there's and you're privy. I mean, that just basically is what it is.
Yeah. You know that I love systems. So the fact that Spear Education Online turns clinical problems and challenges into systems is one of the reasons I love it. So this course is Dr. Frank Spear going through the causes of a gummy smile or excessive gingival display, and then what are the possible treatments for that.
Because the way we make a diagnosis is we list all of the possibilities, and we basically go through an algorithm, a series of steps that removes possibilities, leaving us with the diagnosis. So when we think about a differential diagnosis for a gummy smile, we're going to start with the fact that some people simply have short upper lips. If you have an extremely short upper lip, your lip is not going to cover your gingiva and your teeth. You are going to show gingiva. And so we have to know, how would we assess that? What does a patient with a short upper lip look like? How would we make that diagnosis? We know that there are some patients where the entire maxilla actually over-erupts, what's called vertical maxillary excess. We also know that that usually occurs because the patient tends to have a very short ramus. And when we have a very short ramus, the masseter muscle and medial pterygoid control the amount of posterior tooth eruption.
I've discovered that one of my favorite treatments to do now is aesthetic crown lengthening. And once you've seen that with a patient where you've said, there's more tooth under those gums and we could make these look a whole lot better, and seeing that transformation, it's pretty exciting. So this course helps you more confidently understand and diagnose when that would be appropriate, when there's other treatment modalities. And with that, you'll be able to more confidently diagnose and prescribe treatment for these patients. If you want access to this course and hundreds more like it, go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. Mention the Shared Practices podcast, and that will be an extended 30-day guest pass. And then use the promo code LOW200 for $200 off your annual membership. So going back to this then, this whole assumption and these clauses. So let me see if I can summarize back to you kind of these different things we've talked about, and if there's anything else we need to talk about with this assumption. So the first was that we want to make sure that the landlord is going to be reasonable. And what was that term again?
Not be unreasonably withheld.
Not be unreasonably withheld. So that's what you're looking for. And the opposite of that is at the owner's sole discretion.
Yep.
Okay. So that's
discretion. Yep.
At the landlord's discretion. So that's like the first set of terms to look out for. The second is this clause that allows them to recapture. Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now, I got to be very honest. I have seen that used never. I've just heard the threats. I've heard the same stories that the dentists have used. But I personally, in my 7 years and hundreds of transactions, have never seen a landlord exercise the recapture clause in a negative way to hurt a dentist.
Okay.
I've never seen it. I've seen it in lots of leases. And it certainly is something that we need to be aware of when we go and negotiate with the landlord. But I personally, now I'm not saying it doesn't happen because I've heard the story, but I haven't seen that.
Okay. And I guess this would be a moment to step back and make the bigger point of, I think landlords in general like dentists. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And what the landlord really wants is the dentist to just keep paying the bills.
Yeah.
He just doesn't want a disruption in that bill.
It probably makes your job of creating this goodwill with the landlord and smoothing that transition. It gives you maybe a little bit of a leg up versus haircut stores or whatever that would be coming into these spaces. So it gives you a nice, the ability and the power to negotiate in our favor. I
agree. Now, I will tell you that landlords that are really savvy and understand the need for a dental location to stay in the same place during the transition, they give zero concessions.
Okay.
So it's really critical, the setup and how to set up and properly position the assumption. If you're trying to negotiate lease term and lease rate and all that jazz, if you're trying to negotiate, it's really important that the setup is such that you have leverage to relocate and renew and go somewhere else, relocate and go somewhere else, or merge with someone else. I mean, there's lots of options that you're looking at. It's important that landlords, and it's important that you're not dishonest with that. It's important that there really are options.
Sure.
And that's what we do, because we understand the marketplace and know where the locations are. We create leverage in those conversations that allow for concessions to occur. But if a landlord doesn't feel like concessions need to happen, and the sale of the practice is going to happen regardless, which sometimes occurs.
Yeah.
Then the landlord's just going to sit and wait for the guy to assume the lease $10 above the market rate.
So
somebody will come along and assume it.
It goes both ways. They like you as a tenant, and so if you have the option to walk away or renew a lease, you have a little bit of the upper hand. But if they've got you locked in, they might have a little bit of the upper hand because they know how tied your business is to the equipment and the improvements that were made within the practice and the patients being familiar with that location. So I guess it goes both ways.
That's exactly right. So, and landlords are smart.
Sure.
So you got to be.
They're not usually charitable organizations that are landlords.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So just to wrap up the previous discussion about those different terms, this last personal guarantee, is there a way to not get stuck as the personal guarantee when the lease transfers? Is that where that recapture clause would actually benefit you because now they void that old lease and make a new lease in the new owner's name?
Yeah. Yes. But the people that it's catching, let's be clear, the people that it's affecting are the selling dentists, not the buying dentists.
Correct.
And the way to address that is not during the transition phase. We address getting dentists off of guarantees during lease renewal periods. So most dentists stay in a place for 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
So you got to look at this as stages, and you're setting your lease up to sell eventually. So you're in a lease for 5 or 10 years on that initial term. It is very unlikely you're going to get released from a personal guarantee or be able to get out of a guarantee during your initial term.
Okay.
But as you hire a broker that knows what they're doing, they can help you get out of lease, out of guarantees as you move forward. And the best clause, of course, is, hey, I've been here for 20, 25 years. If I sell my practice, I will no longer stay on as a guarantor. The new buyer will be the guarantor.
Okay, cool.
And that happens often when we can set it up right during a renewal. So that's more for the selling dentist. But the buying dentist, as a buying dentist, my experience is you're going to sign a guarantee.
Right.
There's risk involved in moving from the selling dentist to the buying dentist. You're going to sign the guarantee in most cases, in almost all cases. And if a landlord doesn't ask for a guarantee, then you should be jumping up and down and saying, heck yeah.
Okay, cool. So, and down the road, maybe you'll be able to get off that, but not right up front.
That is exactly right. Yep.
Okay, cool. In terms of this transfer, assumption of the lease, is there any other critical pieces or terms related to that actual assumption event? There's a whole bunch of other terms that affect whether it's a good lease or not. But in terms of the assumption event, is there anything else that we haven't covered?
Yeah, well, the only thing I would say is oftentimes in that lease assumption place, it gives a time frame for a landlord to respond.
Okay.
I've seen it upwards of 60 days.
That's annoying.
So most buyers are not that patient.
Yeah.
Most selling dentists aren't that patient.
Yeah.
And it becomes really annoying. You need to understand that a landlord hates lease assumptions.
Yeah.
They don't like them. It's not their top priority. So you need to get started on it fairly early because it's not their priority. It's not a revenue generating event for their business. This is just noise for them.
Okay.
It's noise. They already have someone committed for some level of term. They already are very comfortable with that person. And so everything else is just noise. And you need to have someone that can be consistent in presenting the message and help the landlord push forward that paperwork. Because, the majority of transitions, you're waiting on the lease.
Yeah.
The lease becomes the last thing that you're waiting on. And by the way, the lease has to be fully executed. It has to be signed by both the tenant and the landlord. The buying dentist and the landlord and the selling dentist has to be signed, and the banks have to see the execution copy in order to release the funds to close on the practice.
Okay.
And so it becomes usually and typically it becomes something that everybody's sitting around waiting on.
Delays the closing.
So, yeah, you don't want to let that happen. You want to jump on it early, get it started early, get the process rolling. And landlords usually go through with it and go through the process, but at the end of the day, just be ready for that as a buying dentist. It's not the selling dentist's fault, and it's not really even the landlord's fault. The landlord views this as a non-revenue event, and they view it kind of as a nuisance.
Right. They've got to sit down and re-review everything, maybe hire a lawyer to look at all this. And
Yep.
okay. No, that's awesome. So the timing of this, both, asking the broker up front, and then as soon as that LOI is in and things look like they're going to happen, the sooner you get going on this process, the better.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, cool. So now I'm just trying to think, do we want to look at more terms in a lease for a dentist going into a practice that can be good or bad? Or do you think we should move on to this question of buying versus leasing overall?
You bet. Let me just address one thing on the terms.
Okay.
I received a phone call from a dentist that's buying a practice. It's your typical situation. There are no brokers involved. They're friends. They found the practice. It's perfect scenario. The practice is generating about $450,000. So it's not a huge practice. And the lease that is there is almost 20% of collections. Okay.
Wow.
It's a really, really high lease. So we talk about lease terms. We said that we want to look at what the length of term is. We also want to look at what the lease rate is. And here is what I've seen as the big mistakes. Everybody knows that a lease, your typical accounting firms, dental accounting firms, and the dental P&Ls, they all say, hey, we want to try to keep our lease between 5 and 7%.
Okay.
That's our number, 5 to 7% of the collections. When you see collections, that rent number being 20 and 30% of collections, you need to be nervous.
Yeah, that's a lot.
You need to ask yourself, oh my goodness, why is the lease so high and the collections low? And here's what I love about dentists. I love dentists. Every dentist I meet thinks that they can do it better than the guy before. I love it. Every dentist is just bullish in their own approach. And I love that. But this particular call, the dentist on the other line said, oh, I'm just going to pump this baby up to $800,000, $900,000 in the next 2 years, and it won't be a problem. And I said, let me just tell you, that's where I find and you're asking for my honest advice. My honest advice is you need to pause. You need to identify why are the collections lower than you think they should be. And what is your strategy to double the collections in the next 24 months? What is your strategy? Because if the strategy is, oh, they're just going to come, then I'm going to question and say, hey, you need to look differently. Okay. But if the strategy is, hey, the dentist hasn't been working, he's only there 2 days a week, he's older, he's slower, he's not doing the amount of procedures that I'm doing, then you can start to build a case where it may make sense. But from a pure lease perspective, the people I find that get in trouble are individuals that think they're just going to get their collections up to get it to that 5 to 7%.
Okay. So just assuming that it's going to grow and
yeah.
And there could be a rare circumstance where you truly understand the potential, but this would have to be one of these practices that like looks like a dog, but there's growth here, there's untapped potential, and you have an exact plan of how to extract that value and that potential out of it. Then you could maybe justify something like this. But if you're just like in general saying, yeah, we'll just grow, that's what dental practices do, they just grow, that's the red flag moment.
Yep. Now I'm gonna segue into our third question right now because this is very important. Lots of times old doctors that are the landlords that don't have a lease, rather than pegging that lease rate to a market rate, they peg it to the 5 to 7% of collections. And all the dental consultants and all the transition brokers that look at the numbers never say, hey, that lease is out of market. They don't know what market is.
Sure.
They just simply say, oh, it looks in line, move forward. Well, I've had a circumstance where a dentist signed a lease and every market's different, but the dentist signed the lease at $49 triple net.
Wow.
Now, I did a deal in that exact building at $16 triple net. That's how far above market the dentist was.
Wow.
And the reason that he did that is because the landlord was the selling dentist. He owned the building, and they pegged the lease to the percentage of collections, not to the market.
They knew he could afford it.
That's exactly, well, it's exactly right. The collections and the practice can afford that lease.
Yeah.
But so you need to make sure that the lease rate, when you're dealing with a doctor or a new lease, and even when you're dealing with the simple assumption, what is market? Go out and find out what the exact market price should be for a lease.
And that, for commercial real estate, that's almost always going to be expressed in a per square foot basis, correct?
That's correct. And some people have annual rates and some people have monthly rates depending on the state and the market.
Sure.
But you're always going to be able to find that. Now, recognize that starting rates are usually introductory offers and have a little bit lower lease rates, the starting rates. So you want to talk to a commercial real estate broker that knows dental.
Okay.
And get what the market is and understand, hey, am I paying a little bit above market, or am I at market, or am I below market? And guess what? I've found the guys that are below market, and I tell them to do a 7 or a 10-year lease.
Just lock it in.
They're way below market. And I've done a 10-year lease where all 10 years of the lease is below today's market.
They just locked it right in.
And lock it in.
Yeah.
Your 2% of collections. Let's do this longer.
Yeah, let's write it out.
Let's secure this.
Cool.
So anyway, that kind of goes into terms. You asked about terms, and we asked about old doc and landlord.
Yeah.
And that, that really becomes the conversation. Making sure that lease rate is pegged to market rather than pegged to percent of collections.
Okay, well, I think this is a really good opportunity to actually talk about what is the anatomy of a commercial lease, just in general, some of the big points that you kind of need to understand to look at it. And so you talked about a dollar figure per square foot as a triple net lease. So explain to the non-real estate who's never bought a home, never bought a practice, what does that mean? And is that standard, or is that, specific to dental, or is that, just a commercial real estate thing?
You bet. Thank you. There are multiple different types of lease structures. A triple net lease is basically where you pay the base rent and then you pay a percentage of all the expenses on the building as an additional rent. So let's say you're in a 10,000 square foot building and you have 1,000 square feet. So you are in 10% of the building.
Okay.
That when the tax bill comes, guess who's paying 10% of the taxes?
We are.
You are. You're paying your own utilities. You're paying your own janitorial expense. You're paying when the parking lot gets resurfaced, you're paying 10% of that. You're paying 10% of all the expenses on the building. Richard, if you and I are owners, we want to have triple net leases
all day long.
We pass on all the expenses of the building, and we pass on even administration costs to manage the building. We're getting paid a base rent, plus we're getting all of our expenses covered by the tenants. There's nothing better in a real estate world than having a fully leased triple net building. That's a very lucrative deal for landlords.
And so what does the triple net, what does the net mean? Usually
those nets stand for taxes, insurance, and the common area maintenance.
Taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. So those are the expenses that get passed along to you as the tenant.
That's right. That's right. On the opposite, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, is that like the standard? What percentage of leases are you doing that are triple net leases versus something else?
Good question. It usually is more based on product type.
Okay.
So typically you'll see all your retail dental locations in triple net leases.
Okay. So if you're next to Jimmy John's or Safeway or something like that, it's probably going to be a triple net lease.
That's exactly right. That's your typical. Now, all of this is based on what the landlord and the tenant decide, right? I mean, it's
Sure. It's negotiable.
But retail locations are usually triple net lease. On the opposite side of the equation, you have office buildings. You know, your big glass office buildings in any market are usually full service or gross leases.
Okay.
We call them either full service or you'll hear the term gross. And those leases basically have a lease rate that includes everything from electricity, janitorial, the taxes, the insurance, all of the common area maintenance. It's all included in the base rate.
So you're still paying for it. It's just a matter of what we're calling it.
Exactly. So let's say you're looking at a building and the nets are $5 a square foot, and you're looking across the street at the retail space, and the retail space is $15 triple net, and the office building across the street is $20 triple net. It's actually the same lease terms. Now, I got to say with one big caveat, triple net leases, you usually assume all the liability of the maintenance of the space, such as the HVAC units. If the HVAC units go out and you're in a retail establishment and a true triple net lease, you are replacing that HVAC unit.
Are you you're just doing that out of pocket? Like there's no...
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So you kind of have to maybe have a little bit of a savings of just in case in your practice.
Yeah. And so, but you need to understand that in a triple net lease. And some triple net leases will have the landlord pay for the initial cost, and they'll just have you reimbursed through those triple nets, those CAM expenses.
Okay.
So every lease is really, really different. And I hate to use that term, but a true triple net lease has all the costs and the expenses of the building and the maintenance of the building being borne by the tenant at the time that. So somebody breaks your window, you're replacing the window.
So you practically own the space, like all of the owner headaches and problems and costs, just without actually owning it.
Yeah. Yes, except for you have a property manager by the landlord that takes care of a lot of the common area stuff.
Okay. So
but yes,
keeping the parking lot paved, or the thing is clean and the grass mowed and stuff like that.
Yep.
Okay.
So on the opposite side, on that gross lease, usually the landlord carries their obligation to repair the HVAC and to replace and repair any of the major issues.
Okay.
Now, believe me, a landlord's going to get their money, and they do have the ability to come back and collect when expenses go up, such as taxes, or they would never enter into a long-term lease. If they didn't have the ability to come to you and if taxes double and be able to somehow secure that increase, then they would never enter into a long-term lease. So, but that's probably a conversation for, we could hop on multiple different types of leases. Triple net and gross are the two ends of the spectrum. And then you'll hear a term modified gross. And a modified gross basically is modified, where the landlord can say, I'm going to pay for taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance, but you, Mr. Tenant, are going to pay for electricity and janitorial. So it can, and that modified word can be modified in any way. I've seen leases where, the landlord's paying for taxes and insurance, and the tenant's paying for the common area maintenance.
Okay.
And so there's just lots of different structures that you can jump into when you get into a modified lease. But usually you just think professional office building, glass building, that's going to be a gross lease. And a triple net lease is going to be more retail. Now, this has long since dictated how dentists operate, right? Most of your specialists go to a full service building, a nicer professional building that don't pay the triple nets, because it usually ends up being a lower lease rate over the course of time. And they don't have to pay for all these, they don't have to carry the liability of the HVAC units. Whereas general dentist practices are all about signage, visibility, and exposure. They're the ones that are paying the net. They're usually higher prices, and they're the ones paying for that exposure. So
okay, cool. That wraps everything up, because I was thinking okay, just know that you're going to have to pay this, or you're not going to have to pay this. I was thinking that the most important factor was know what you're responsible for and what that's going to look like on an ongoing basis. But how you just phrased it right now puts it in a really good perspective. GP, you typically want visibility because you're trying to find new patients. Specialists, sure, you might still want some visibility, but if you have a lot of referring docs, which is the traditional model, you're going to be okay if you're tucked back in a lower maintenance space that doesn't have you dealing with a little bit more of the headaches.
Yep. And that's absolutely been the case over the last, 20 plus years in dentistry.
Okay.
It is quickly changing to a signage visibility exposure. The marketplace, at least in Arizona, is quickly changing to where everybody wants to have the corner. Everybody wants signage visibility exposure.
Yeah.
And so, every marketplace is different. Every marketplace is changing in that manner.
Sure. Okay, cool. And that really helps us put perspective on that whole conversation, because I was like, oh man, we're getting pretty deep in the weeds. I hope we haven't lost anyone. I think that was really, really good. And I think that's about the level people need to understand it. And then if it gets more specific of some modified combination in between, then that's what they have people like you for.
Exactly. And we're definitely in the weeds when we get into those dialogues without a specific lease in front of you. But
yeah, that was great. I asked the question. So that was exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. So the next question I was going to ask, what are other general terms, that we should be caring about in a lease in general? So,
yeah. If you have the ability to negotiate a lease, right, when you're assuming the lease, I would always look for a relocation clause.
Okay.
Landlords love relocation clauses. And what a relocation clause is that it basically says, hey, if we want to, we can take you and put you in the different part of our building or different part of our real estate. Okay. So I've had situations where
that sounds awful for a dental office because of all the plumbing and cabinetry and equipment. That's like a nightmare.
Exactly. I am working right now on a situation where I have an orthodontist, 20 plus years in the same location, first floor. Pediatric dentist is just above him on the second or third floor, and has a great referral system rolling. Great situation for him. He's been there. He's right off the lobby. You walk in the main lobby. He's on the left-hand side. He's bam there.
Yeah.
Well, an oncology location that occupies the entire rest of the first floor wants the entire first floor. The landlord has a relocation option.
Oh.
And has basically come and chosen to exercise its relocation option and say, hey, Mr. Orthodontist, I want you to go upstairs and down this hall and go into this location, and I have the right to move you and I have the right to be able to do this. And so, those circumstances exist. We've had a situation where, and I've already said Jimmy John's, I've had a situation where a general dentist is in a retail plaza out on the corner, and they're paying in the mid-20s triple net, and fast food like Jimmy John's, and Jimmy John's was the fast food that basically comes in and says, hey, we'll pay mid-40s triple net for that location. We don't want to be on the inline space. Well, guess what? You have a relocation clause. The landlord says, man, I'm going to make double the money on Jimmy John's than I am on you.
Yeah.
I have a relocation clause on you. I'm going to put you on the back corner of this place, and I have all the rights to be able to do so.
Would they have to give you any new tenant improvements or not at all?
They do, yeah. And typically that's very vague in a lease. But if there is a relocation clause in the lease, you want it to be very specific that the landlord's going to pay for the relocation, that the landlord's going to reimburse for your moving costs, that you're going to be able to choose a dental contractor, a dental architect. You're going to be able to work with whom you want to work with, because at that case, if the landlord's doing it, then the landlord usually is looking for the lowest cost alternative, and it doesn't necessarily bode well. But so your specific question is what terms do you look for? I would always look to see if there's options. There needs to be options in leases. And I'm going to use the word never, and I haven't used it this entire call. You should never sign a lease without options.
Okay.
And that's a never. You always need to have an option on the lease. I've had dental practices that are crushing it basically come to the end of their lease, and the landlord say, okay, thanks for being here. Have a good day.
Oh, that's awful.
I've had it. And we want the space next to you to expand, and we want to save them. And, there's lots of different reasons, but I've seen it. I've seen dentists basically come to the end of their term and not have options. And so you always want to have options.
So you want to have an option, and then when you exercise that option, you want a new option.
Absolutely. You don't sign a lease renewal without another option.
Okay.
Dentists always need options.
Okay.
You always have an option. You try hard to get that relocation clause completely removed. We've already talked about the lease assumption clause that needs to absolutely say cannot be unreasonably withheld.
Okay. And
that's something that we like to see.
The other one I was going to ask you about was not having other dentists or the same specialty within the same space. Is that a common term that dentists can get, or is that one that's a little harder to get?
It's very common in retail establishments to have exclusivity.
Exclusivity. Okay.
Yep. So that's very common in retail. In professional office buildings,
not so much.
It's not as common. I mean, you have a 70,000 square foot building and you're 2,500 square feet of that. They're probably not going to say we're not going to do another general dentistry deal. Okay. So it depends on the location. But in retail, most retail landlords give exclusivities.
Okay. So that's something to look for, and to know that if you're assuming a lease that doesn't have that and you're in a retail space, it technically means that some other dentist could show up 2 doors down, literally.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep.
Is there any other major terms when either crafting this lease from scratch with an owner doc, or when purchasing a practice and red flags or things to negotiate? Is there anything else left on the table here?
Though we've caught the main ones. We've caught the main ones that we've talked a little bit about guarantees and limiting guarantees, doing whatever you can to limit that exposure is critical on a lease as well. But we've caught the main ones that I would say you absolutely want to understand and know in your dental lease. Okay,
cool. And then in terms of actually negotiating this, it goes back to that earlier statement of, if you are at a renewal point, you have more leverage, and someone like you would be able to help us come in and maximize that leverage. Is there any ability to renegotiate something if you're like smack dab in the middle of this lease and it's like still has another 5 years to go? How do you go about renegotiating some of these terms that you're going to inherit when you assume that lease?
Yeah, you absolutely can renegotiate leases in midterm if you have some level of an event. And purchasing a practice or selling a practice is an event.
Okay.
It's an event that allows you to go to the landlord and ask for things. Now, depending on whether or not you have leverage, you're going to get it or not.
Right.
But you certainly can say, hey, I've reviewed the lease and I don't like this clause. And is there, can we strike the relocation? If they say no, you've at least asked for it. You just don't want to get overbearing in the middle of if you don't have leverage to where they don't want, they unreasonably withhold their consent to transfer the lease.
Sure.
So it's just kind of a tightrope and a balancing act on that.
How often are you negotiating? If you're assuming the lease, I'm guessing that you can renegotiate clauses, but not necessarily dollar per square foot. Is that a safe assumption, or can you sometimes renegotiate that?
You can negotiate that depending on lease term.
Okay.
But most of the time, you're not going to get concessions until after the current term.
Okay.
Because the landlord's already got that on their books.
Yep.
They've already got it obligated. Yeah. They've got it obligated.
So it would be more, rather than coming in and saying we need to renegotiate the cost per square foot, it might be more likely to get concessions with specific terms.
Yes. Now, let me share one experience though. So I had an experience where market fell. This is back in 2007, 2008,
right?
2009. Actually, I didn't come in until 2010, but the market fell in 07 and 08 in Phoenix, 08, 09. And in 2010, 2011, we're starting to climb a little bit, but the market was completely depressed. So the selling dentist lease rate was significantly higher than the market rate.
Okay.
I renegotiated. My client was the buying dentist, not the selling dentist. I renegotiated with the landlord a new lease, a 5-year lease at market rate terms.
Hmm.
And it ended up being a delta, let's just call it, I don't know what the specific numbers, but it was north of $30,000 to $40,000.
Wow. Okay.
And the landlord said, hey, we're happy to enter into a new lease with the buying dentist. We're happy to assign the lease, but we need this $40,000. So part of the proceeds of the practice sale paid the landlord the delta between the lease that selling dentist was already obligated on and the market rate that the buying dentist inherited.
So essentially, that got wrapped into their loan rather than wrapped into the lease.
Well, no, they didn't pay any more for the practice.
Oh.
It just came out of the seller's proceeds of the practice.
So the seller, the seller was motivated enough to get the deal done that they paid for it.
That's right.
Okay. Interesting.
So you don't, I guess what I'm saying with that is you don't just have to sit back and accept the lease terms that the selling dentist has.
Sure.
You can enter into a market lease. There's lots of scenarios. Now, some sellers may say, pound sand, Mr. Buyer, I'm not doing that. But if the selling dentist is desperate enough and realizes that nobody's going to buy my practice and inherit this lease that's over market, I have to do something. Either I wait till the term's out, sell my charts to someone down the road, renegotiate a lease, wait till the market comes back or whatever it may be, or I cut my losses. There's lots of dentists that would simply just cut their losses.
Sure. Okay. So don't assume anything. Make sure that you're thinking about this and asking when it's appropriate, and you've got someone like you to negotiate on your behalf.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we're running out of time to hit the last topic, which was this topic of buying versus leasing and what that means in a transition. So I think I want to have you back, and maybe, no promises. I feel like this is a little bit more, not complex, but it has more ramifications in terms of like lending and personal finance and, retirement and stuff like that overall. So I think it's a super important topic, and maybe we can even do like a little roundtable interview with you and Matt and like Reese Harper or someone like that and get a variety of perspectives. So maybe we can try and do something like that. But I think you crushed it in terms of the nitty gritty of what you need to know going into negotiating a lease and in an acquisition and potentially creating a new lease with the old doc as he's leaving. So this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of this specific information, and also how people can really leverage this and use this to the maximum benefit.
You bet. Excited to be on the show, and would love to come back.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich. We'll talk to you soon. Okay, Rich had some really great specifics and also some broad takeaways. The thing that most surprised me right up front was the idea that you, even coming into a lease, you still can sometimes renegotiate right then. And there's certain moments that you have negotiating power with this landlord because they want you as a tenant. And there's other moments where they've kind of got you there and you don't have negotiating power. So that was, for me, the biggest overall takeaway from this episode. What did you get out of it?
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of hard to take away very specific things because, I'm going to be going into a lease myself. And, a lot of those provisions don't apply to my situation. So for me, it's mainly looking at how the lease works. What does it mean? And then how do you have leverage between the landlord? And then again, like you said, not letting those opportunities pass by and taking advantage of them for when you do have them.
And remind me again, or remind our audience too, the practice that you're buying, is he going to retain the real estate and lease to you, or are you buying? I can't remember.
No, I have a first right of refusal. And then between 5 to 8 years after I acquire, I will buy it. It's funny because, going into the deal, I had in mind that I had to buy the real estate if it was available. And, it's kind of something you hear about. But I think as I found the practice and fell in love with the location and all of that I talk about in my episode, it just became less and less important to me. And I'd rather just have a good lease. And, that's something that we'll be working on. But I'll eventually buy, but I'm not necessarily going to right away because they don't want me to. They want to rent it out for a while.
But that's the owner who's renting it out to you, correct?
Correct. The senior dentist who's leaving.
Okay. And it's funny because I've heard this that go either way. Like, oh, it's such a good deal to buy and build this investment, and having the real estate so important. And then I've heard other people saying, oh, well, it's kind of a wash, and it ends up turning out okay either way. I gave a presentation in dental school on this because this is something I was interested in, and I got 3 faculty at Midwestern. I got their stories, and one of them, she leased and got screwed over and was stuck in this awful huge lease. And then Rich actually helped her, and we talked about that in the episode. One of them, he leased and it was just fine and it was great. And then another one, he purchased, and then the city of Phoenix hiked up their taxes to like 20 grand a year. And he did not expect that, wasn't accounting for that. So it like ended up being super frustrating for him. And then the last one, so I guess there was 4. The last one, he built a big like multi-unit thing, like 4 or 5 units with a couple of other guys. And it's been a phenomenal investment for him. So it can go either way. There is risk involved, but it's another way to just grow and diversify your portfolio, and also has a lot of advantages. And I talked with Rich, and I think we're going to do a second episode. And if the stars align, what I want to get Rich, Matt Porter, and Reese Harper together. And Matt Porter is going to play the part of the banker, and Reese is going to be the financial advisor, and Rich Andrus is going to be the lease negotiator, real estate guy. And so Reese definitely has a less of a real estate slant because he's a stock market guy. And Matt Porter is going to play the role of the bank. So he's going to talk about kind of the getting financing side of things. And then Rich will be kind of the pro real estate guy. So if I can make this happen, I think it's going to be a really fun episode.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that'll answer that question for our listeners again of, do you buy your real estate or not? I don't think there's a straightforward answer. I think it's very situational. Absolutely.
And we'll get into that in that episode. So hope you guys enjoyed this. I had a friend who reached out to me just recently. He's like, what do you know about lease negotiation? I was like, well, let's do an episode on it. So here you go, and enjoy this, and we'll talk to you guys next time.